Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first ever Mayo Clinic National Town Hall on mistrust in the COVID-19 vaccine in the African American community. My name is Dr. LaPrincess Brewer. I'm a preventive cardiologist and researcher at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and I'm honored to serve as the moderator for today's forum. We are delighted and honored to host our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and leading scientist in the development of the Moderna vaccine. We are also pleased to have the founder and CEO of the Balm and Gilead Incorporated, Dr. Pernessa Seele, and Dr. Chyke, the inaugural director of the Mayo Clinic Center for Health Equity and Community Engagement Research. It is also our extreme pleasure to have community heroes on the front lines of COVID-19 outreach join us in a timely discussion on the COVID-19 vaccine and its importance for alleviating the devastating impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on underserved and socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. Throughout the pandemic, Mayo Clinic has remained steadfast in its commitment to playing a prominent role in addressing COVID-19 disparities affecting African Americans head-on through authentic community partnerships and addressing the social determinants or drivers of health. From establishing COVID-19 testing sites in overlooked and under-resourced community health centers, to working alongside community members to counteract misinformation surrounding COVID-19 spread and prevention, we have made it our priority to support our most vulnerable communities. With strong bonds in our most treasured institutions in the African American community, including Black churches, we have worked to ensure that everyone has equal access to COVID-19 vaccines through community-based efforts across the Mayo Clinic enterprise in Minnesota, Florida, and Arizona. Here in Olmsted County, Minnesota, home of Mayo Clinic's flagship hospital, 70% of eligible African Americans have received at least one vaccine dose compared to 57% statewide and about 10% nationwide. But now there's a deadly strain of COVID-19, the Delta variant, on the rise that is unfortunately affecting African Americans more than other groups and threatens to overthrow our efforts here across the country. But we will continue to stand tall, united, and ready to continue our fight against COVID-19. Understandably, due to historical wrongs in our US healthcare system and in research practices, some may have reasonable concerns about getting the COVID-19 vaccine. To address these concerns, we as educators, researchers, and clinicians at Mayo Clinic have convened this town hall today to provide you with accurate and relevant information to inform your decision about getting the COVID-19 vaccine and to also help others in your communities. We have an awesome program for you today, so let's get started. Mr. Jeff Bolton, Mayo Clinic's Chief Administrative Officer, would like to bring greetings to you on behalf of Mayo Clinic.
Hello, and welcome to the first National Mayo Clinic Town Hall meeting on COVID-19 and its impact on the African American community. There's no question that the pandemic has brought social and racial inequity to the forefront of public health. The data speak for themselves. Underrepresented minorities, including African Americans, are more at risk of getting sick, and they're more at risk of dying from COVID-19. Underrepresented minorities are also less likely to have received a vaccine, increasing those risk factors even further. But this isn't a simple case of vaccine hesitancy. This is a result of systemic barriers to healthcare that people of color experience on a daily basis. We're here today as part of the process to remove those barriers. Mayo Clinic is committed to doing everything we can to ensure that everyone can live their healthiest lives, regardless of their race or ethnicity or any other identifier. Now, let's put that commitment into action. We're so grateful to have Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett here to share her expertise with us as a keynote speaker. And we have several other experts in our mix who will offer their insights. Thank you all for your time And of course, a special thank you to the Town Hall Planning Committee for your work in organizing and promoting the event. I know it will be very productive. Thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you, Mr. Bolton, for your service to Mayo Clinic and dedication to health equity. We would also like to send special gratitude to Dr. Gianrico Ferrugia, President and CEO of Mayo Clinic, for his unwavering support of our town hall today. So now it brings me great pleasure to introduce our phenomenal keynote speaker, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, a North Carolina native. Dr. Corbett is an assistant professor of immunology and infectious diseases at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Schutzer, assistant professor of Harvard's Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study and associate member of the Philip T. and Susan M. Reagan Institute. She earned her undergraduate degree in biological sciences from the University of Maryland, where she was a Meyerhoff Scholar and NIH undergraduate scholar. She obtained her Ph.D. in microbiology and immunology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, holding multiple honors, including a director's scholarship. And prior to attending Harvard, sorry, one second, I'm losing my screen here. So prior to attending Harvard, she was a research fellow and scientific lead at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases Vaccine Research Center. Dr. Corbett uses her viral immunology expertise to propel novel vaccine development for pandemic preparedness, including mRNA 1273, a leading vaccine against SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19 infection. The vaccine concept incorporated in mRNA 1273 was designed by Dr. Corbett's NIH team from viral sequence and rapidly deployed to industry partner Moderna Incorporated for a phase 1 clinical trial, which unprecedentedly began only 66 days from viral sequence release. mRNA 1273 was shown to be 94% effective in a phase 3 trial and is authorized for use in multiple countries. Alongside mRNA 1273, Dr. Corbett has a patent portfolio, which also includes universal coronavirus and influenza vaccine concepts and novel therapeutic antibodies. She has over 15 years of scientific excellence, garnering several prestigious awards, such as the Benjamin Franklin Next Gen Award and the Salzman Memorial Award in Virology. Combining her research goals with her knack for mentorship, Dr. Corbett invests much of her time in underserved communities as an advocate of STEM education and vaccine awareness. Please join me in welcoming the one and only Dr. Corbett.
Thank you so much for that very, very warm welcome. And thank you for hosting this kind of event. I think when we met for the pre-call, it was about a week after I'd started at Harvard. And the vaccine efforts around the country were somewhat in a very smooth sailing point. And I thought that one of the things that was necessary with Keynote to do was to give the lay of the land then, very briefly, but then also the lay of the land now and what we are experiencing with this Delta variant and how the vaccine efforts kind of intertwine with what people are hearing kind of day in and day out on the news. So without further ado, as the very eloquent introduction has put, I am Kizzmekia Corbett, and at the point of which I was leading efforts to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, I was at the National Institutes of Health and the Vaccine Research Center, but I am now at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health in the Department of Immunology and Infectious Diseases, where I'm an assistant professor and continuing with much of this work. I don't necessarily like to pick on one place or the other because, as we all know, from looking at the news just about every day, much of the US is in the same situation, where there is an increasing rise in COVID cases around this country and, in fact, around the globe. I point to Minnesota only because the Mayo Clinic was founded in Minnesota, only to show that in the last 2 weeks, there's been about a 55% increase in cases of COVID-19. And the long of it is sure, many people have gotten vaccinated, but we have a very long way to go. And part of this talk is me kind of outlining where we are in the vaccination process, but moreover, why it is so important for people to continue to be vaccinated against this virus. So what would an ideal COVID-19 vaccine do? And, I actually edited this slide yesterday to say ideal, because while the COVID-19 Prevention Network, which is a large consortium of extremely smart experts in the beginning, when we made this slide, we understood that that was implied. But for the general public, quite frankly, many of the things on this slide, it is not so implied. So an ideal COVID-19 vaccine, or just a vaccine against an infectious disease in general, there are two sides of the coin. There's this one side where there is the benefit to the individual, and then there's the other side where it's the benefit to the community. So from an individual standpoint, if you are to get vaccinated, your chances of having reduced severity of illness are greater. If you are to get vaccinated from an individual standpoint, the chances of having a prevention or some level of prevention of infection are greater. And then from a community standpoint, there's this reduction of transmission from a vaccinated person onward. And of course, there is the allowing for us to resume to normal. And we all have our own definition of what normal really means, but the resumption of normal activities like going to work and just kind of enjoying your day-to-day life. So the idea that comes with vaccination is, as many have heard, to be called herd immunity, and I like to call it population immunity. And it is this concept for which I like to deem vaccination beyond oneself, but more so about the level of community service that it gives. So if you have two populations, if you have a population of people who are largely non-immune, like you see here in these blue stick figures, then if a virus was to go out into that population, there will be high levels of transmission. And that is for various levels of reasons, but nevertheless, the people in the red have the ability to be infected with the virus or get infected with the virus. And then in the case of COVID-19, upwards of 1% of those people unfortunately succumb to that disease. Now, if there's a largely immune population, transmission is slower. So those green people really can't get high levels of disease from that virus. And because of that, you really start to see less hospitalizations, you start to see less transmission, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea that you, as a vaccinated person, become one of these green people in your community is ever so important, particularly in days like this where the Delta variant runs rampant. And sure, I know that we've all heard that vaccinated people can spread the Delta variant, but the truth of the matter is the level of which a vaccinated person can transmit the virus is lesser, as I've seen in many studies around the world. And also, because vaccinated people don't necessarily present to the hospital, you become really this roadblock, so to speak, in the community that kind of prevents this spreading of a wild, rapid disease. And so this idea of herd immunity is something that scientists on a kind of a day in and day out basis are becoming less convinced we will get to, because we have, number one, hit this point where there's been a kind of unhalting in our vaccination efforts, amongst other things. But I just kind of wanted to lay this graph out because what it shows is that in an ideal situation, based on what was happening yesterday when I pulled this off of the website, if we were to get herd immunity, so-called, up to 85%, that would be next year around this time for Minnesota alone. So when people say, I'm going to wait on herd immunity, I like to say, this is what you really are saying. You are saying that for your own personal protection, and then for the bit of protection that your vaccination can provide to the community, that is how long you are willing to wait. Which on a mass scale, think about what that means, particularly in communities like, as was said in the introduction, communities of color, and particularly African-American communities, that where a large proportion of the community is just not vaccinated. And so getting to herd immunity in this type of graph is obviously very predictive. And the outlook really depends on multiple factors. There's vaccine distribution and there's vaccine equity, which we could certainly spend another Saturday morning talking about. But really, this part, vaccine uptake, which is really what we get to when we think about the mistrust of COVID-19 vaccines in the African American community. We've heard everything, right? Everything from microchips to the vaccines not being tested in African American people, the idea that the government is trying to control our communities in particular with this vaccine, and fertility concerns, and the Tuskegee experiment, which kind of sets the stage for years, centuries of just medical mistrust that is rightful for people who look like me, quite frankly. But we don't necessarily have, a lot of time to talk about those things. And kind of as I've described over the course of the last year and a half, those things can largely be debunked. And part of why I am here on my Saturday morning is to at least try to help to build a little bit more trust, kind of brick by brick, as I like to say. And part of that is to dispel how we think about vaccine development and this particular vaccine having been developed too fast. The reason why I can talk about this in some level of detail is because I and my team at the National Institutes of Health was embedded in this process the entire time. And so each step along this timeline, which really goes from the point in the latter parts of 2019, when the virus started to cause an outbreak in China, to the point of which the sequences of that virus came out online, all the way through to a phase 1 clinical trial, and quite frankly, beyond, even to this day, where we got into a phase 1 clinical trial very quickly. So that is the part of the story that is given to you in news headlines. This vaccine, rapid development of the mRNA vaccine, and quite frankly, I am guilty of that as well. Because from a scientist perspective, this is gold. You're breaking records, your science is working very well. It looks great, but from the general public's perspective, one of the things that we failed to talk about is all of the work that went into it prior. So there's extensive research, even predating me at the National Institutes of Health, but particularly during my tenure there, where we worked on coronaviruses as a family. Think about it like someone doing research on your cousin to some level of intensity where they can understand exactly what your cousin looks like. And particularly the parts of which your cousin looks like you, like viruses do. They have a family tree just like we do. And there are certain proteins on these viruses that look alike when you think about the family tree. And particularly one of these proteins is called the spike protein. Without going into much level of detail, if you can target the response for one virus in the virus family for that spike protein, then you can really, as we like to call it, plug and play your vaccine technology in the case of a pandemic that is caused by another viral family. So that is exactly what happened. All we did was we understood that protein in the context of another coronavirus that had been circulating since 2013, believe it or not, MERS coronavirus. And because we understood how to make a really good spike protein vaccine for it, we were able to go very fast. So the vaccine technology could be produced very quickly in vast quantities. We were able to lead with reliability. So the vaccine technology can uphold a level of manufacturability standard, and it's universal in the way that you can plug and play your design concept in the case of a new virus. That's actually the beauty of these mRNA platforms and all, is that you can really understand how to make the good vaccine. And when a new thing comes about, particularly within that same viral family, you can be kind of locked and loaded. And this mRNA technology does look scary because it's like, what this new technology that's, well, as of before last week, had never been fully licensed and approved by the, at least the United States' FDA, and et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. But the beauty of this kind of technology is that contrary to classical vaccine designs where you are getting kind of a whole inactivated virus or a very weak virus, or you might be getting protein, for example, you are actually allowing your body to become the vaccine factory. Your cells doing exactly what they were built to do, read the message for that spike protein, and then that message is read and the spike protein is made for a very short amount of time, not that it stays around forever, and your body builds up a very specific and high level immunity to that protein. So we did that. We did that in collaboration with Moderna, and I can't talk about all of these steps, but the gist of this is that what's highlighted in this light red color are all of the steps that nobody talks about, no one knows about, but they existed. And there are documents to say that, yes, of course, the vaccine was tested in animals prior to going into clinical trial, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There were no steps along this process that were omitted just to move quickly. What happened is that we were allowed to have a more streamlined process because we'd been to the rodeo before. And we, in so many ways, knew what we were going to do because we practiced in the context of the MERS, at least from a preclinical standpoint. So yeah, Moderna was able to really pull the trigger on making a clinical grade drug product very quickly. And then they were able to ship that drug product very quickly, landing us into a phase 1 clinical trial. Those data are old news now, because there's phase 1 clinical trial, which just kind of assesses the safety of a vaccine in a small amount of people. Then there's a phase 2 clinical trial that bumps that level of testing up a notch into a more, into a subset of people that is about 100 or 10 times more. So if you go from 50 people to 500 people in a phase 2 clinical trial, and then you get into a phase 3 clinical trial. And that is where the vaccine is tested for its actual efficacy, along with also at all times, the safety of the vaccine. So that's when you test the vaccine against a placebo, which is just salt water. And then you have another set of people who are vaccinated, and you count the COVID cases, noting you count the COVID cases, not you count the number of infections, because that is just the truth of the matter. From a vaccine standpoint, the way that you get yourself out of a very deadly pandemic with a virus that is spreading like wildfire is that you have to say that your first goal is to prevent very severe disease. And so when someone in this trial presented with a symptom, they could go to the clinical trial physician and get tested for tested for the virus that causes COVID, and then they're counted as a case or not. Over the course of the clinical trial, the cases in the people that got the salt water were more than the people that got the vaccine. And this is across all of the clinical trials for which the FDA has either authorized or approved the vaccines. So that's how you get your 94 or 95% efficacy. Also noting that this type of efficacy reading starts right there at the 1 to 2 week time point following the vaccination. So you are really looking at kind of the acute level of protection, or the level of protection immediately after someone is fully vaccinated. There are, of course, adverse events, as the FDA calls them, but in vaccinology, what we call them is reactogenicity. This is if you got the vaccine and you feel something, there's an 80% chance that you will. And that is just the honest truth. You will probably feel pain, and in your injection site, you might get a fever. I personally had lots of fatigue, but given the fact of how much we've worked in the last year, I was very happy to take a nap. And about 80% of the people in the clinical trials feel those kinds of things, and about 80% of people in the general public feel those kinds of things. But noting that that is not an indication that the vaccine is unsafe, but rather that it is waking up your immune system and making your immune system more alert to the danger signals that are encompassed on that particular spike protein. So now that your immune system is alert, your immune system can go off and protect you against the virus because it knows what that virus looks like, because you've taught it, because you showed it the protein on the surface of the virus. Now, you would think that after all of that, with the phase 3 efficacy results and the mRNA vaccines that are currently being used in multiple countries, that we would be able to mic drop and kind of walk away. Well, the work is never done, for sure, in any scientific progression or of anything. But in this case, one of the reasons why Mayo Clinic feels that it is important to kind of have this town hall on a Saturday morning is because there is still about 20% of Black people who say they just do not plan to get the vaccine. And as we're saying, particularly as different variants kind of sweep throughout this country and the world, And as time progresses, you can see the disparity in the coronavirus infections. This graph is particularly from the District of Columbia, or Chocolate City, as we call it, where I used to live. But the disparity in the amount of COVID cases in African-American communities versus their white counterparts continues to widen, actually, even more so than they did last year, when we were thinking about, 3 times more COVID infections, or 3 times more likely to land in the hospital if you were African American. And sure, it's not all of our fault. We all know that there are social economic things that cause for us to get more ill, from not just from the SARS-CoV-2 virus, but in general. But then there also, as time progresses, the mistrust and the questions around our mistrust change just as the science changes, and it's quite fair. So we have a vaccine that is approved, but why is it not yet approved for young kids? Still, the questions of whether or not the vaccine is being forced on us is something that comes up. And then as you turn on the news and hear about various companies having vaccine mandates, it is of course scary, and even more so if you haven't particularly made the decision to get the vaccine for yourself and for your family. And then we talked about the idea of waiting for herd immunity. But 2 questions that I had to pare it down to, kind of to end this keynote, is that right now, 2 of the main questions are, what about the variants? And will I have to get a booster shot? And one of the things that I like to actually just say to communities when I talk to them is, one of the reasons why I chose science as a career is because no one day is alike. And every single day, we get to wake up as scientists and answer the questions that nature presents to us. And we are at that point kind of in science where nature has presented those types of questions. And sorry about the glariness in this photo. So while we published all of the vaccine data last year in 2020, recently one paper that we led that came out showed how the antibody response, so these are the little proteins that target the virus that your body builds up inside of itself to allow you to have prevention of very severe disease. We published a paper that showed how the protection in both your lower airway and your upper airway happens because of these antibodies. And I show this schema because one of the things that is important is that, number one, we can test these really important concepts in different animal models. In this case, we test these concepts in primate model. And I want to remind people that the testing of these types of very intricate scientific questions continues to happen. And that is why the progression of the information that you get kind of on a day-to-day basis, albeit confusing often, continues to happen as well. And one of the things that is very clear is that you get these antibody responses in your body, and there's a gradient in your airway. So you have a lot of antibodies that can protect you from a lower airway disease infection. These are the types of antibodies that keep you out of being in the hospital if you get a COVID infection. And then there's a gradient of antibodies where you have antibodies that are right here in your nasal cavity that can prevent you from getting more mild illness, or potentially prevent you from transmitting the virus onward, or reducing the level of transmission shall you get infected with the virus. The thing is, this is where we started. All right, it's not coming up. Okay. This is where we started, where about 2 weeks after your vaccination, you have these very high levels of antibodies in both places, your nose and also in your lung. And we also started at the point where the strain that was circulating in this country and around the globe was not so far different from the strain that was of the spike protein that was encompassed in the vaccine. Now, where are we? We're at the point where the pandemic continues, time continues to pass by. There are variants that are circulating, but fret you not. The vaccine is still working because we are here, where the vaccine is still largely, overwhelmingly protecting people from really severe lower respiratory airway disease. And I want to remind people of those data. because everyone has seen kind of the original data, right? We show it all the time in our purple and orange graphs as we give these talks around the country, 95, 94% efficacy. Remembering that that is an overwhelming amount of efficacy, and we were all jumping for joy when those efficacy results come out. So if you hear that now the efficacy of the vaccine has changed to what is, in my opinion, actually still quite admirable in the 80%, for example, it is because time passes, different variants are circulating, but in the prevention and the rate of which one might have a COVID case, and particularly one that is severe and one that ends them in the hospital, still sits at around 3 times more preventive in a vaccinated person as opposed to an unvaccinated person. So one thing that is extremely important to say as I end this keynote is that we are at the point where the decision that we all thought that we had last year, for example, at this time, is to get vaccinated or not, and maybe be able to avoid this virus, is not necessarily the same decision that we have today. Today, the decision is when, because you will, with the level of transmission about 2 times for this Delta variant than it was for the original strains, when you come in contact with the virus that causes COVID-19, would you rather be protected by a vaccine or not? And the truth of the matter is the risk assessment that you make in that instance is one that you have to take around the level of hospitalizations that are coming from the Delta variant, which are greater than that, obviously, than from the original strain. The level of time in the hospital that people have, the amount of transmission that you might be able to give off with the Delta variant as before. And so then the same way that the science changes, in the same way, it's the same way that your risk assessment has to change. And so without further ado, I think there is a panel after this, and I'm very happy to answer any questions around anything that I talked about or any of the other concerns that people might have around the vaccine. Thank you.
Wow, just wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Corbett, for that amazing presentation. Thank you for taking us on your journey through the development of the Moderna vaccine and for dispelling common myths about the COVID-19 vaccine. Our viewers are now more informed and can use this information to make the best decision about getting the vaccine to protect themselves and others from COVID-19. Later in the program, Dr. Corbett, our invited community members will have the opportunity to ask you questions directly. But now we will have our distinguished panelists, Dr. Pernessa Seele and Dr. Chyke Doubeni, join us. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So Dr. Pernessa Seele is the founder and CEO of the Balm and Gilead Incorporated, a not-for-profit organization celebrating 30 years of strengthening the capacity of faith institutions in the United States and in Africa to promote health education and services that contribute to the elimination of health disparities. She is a pioneer in developing public health and faith-based models for engaging individuals in health promotion and disease prevention interventions. She has a number of prestigious awards, including Time Magazine's Most Influential Persons in the World and one of Essence Magazine's 35 Most Beautiful and Remarkable Women in the World. Clark Atlanta University honored Dr. Seele with the 2008 Pathway of Excellence Award, citing her as one of the most outstanding graduates of all time. In October 2017, His Eminence Timothy Michael Cardinal Dolan, Archbishop of New York, bestowed the Pierre Toussaint Medallion upon Dr. Seele. And she's also an honorary member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. And Dr. Seele received a Bachelor of Science degree and Master of Science in Immunology from Clark Atlanta University, and respectively Humane Letters from the College of New Rochelle, New York in 2007. She's a native of Lincolnville, South Carolina. Welcome, Dr. Seele.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Brewer.
Awesome. And Dr. Chyke Doubeni is professor of family medicine and the inaugural director of the Mayo Clinic Center for Health Equity and Community Engagement Research. He also serves as the associate director for community outreach and engagement in the Mayo Clinic Cancer Center. He is a member of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force and has served on scientific panels. He received the 2010 Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers, the highest honor bestowed by the U.S. government on science and engineering professionals in the early stages of their career for accomplishments in research, mentoring, and community service. He also received the Sadie Gerson Distinguished Scholar Award from the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Doubeni has expertise in clinical and public health interventions to improve access to care and reduce disparities in the burden of chronic disease in communities. He has conducted extensive research in delivery systems and communities to improve the process, quality, and effectiveness of cancer prevention and screening that has informed guidelines and efforts internationally on improving cancer screening with a focus on colorectal cancer. So thank you for your leadership, Dr. Doubeni, and for joining us.
Thank you for your leadership, Dr. Brewer.
Thank you. So we really hope that both of you can lead us in a response to Dr. Corbett's awesome presentation and really offer our audience any insights that you may have. So let's start our discussion with Dr. Seele.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and Dr. Corbett, thank you so much for that just extraordinary presentation. It was just so helpful. And I want to thank those, I've been looking at the chat, and I am really happy to see so many health ministries attending this webinar. I see my sorors from Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. I see my sisters from Delta Sigma Theta. And I think this is so critical. I'm recognizing you because it is so critical that you take this information that Dr. Corbett has shared and really, really intensify our efforts of getting this information out and really getting our family members and our community members to understand that we must get vaccinated. I think that, we are at a place, I know in my community and in my family, where we just don't believe. Those of us who have taken the vaccine, we're talking, and I've never seen so many non-scientists who are saying, I've done research and probably have had maybe a bachelor's degree, maybe sometime a high school degree, but they have done the research and they're sharing in the miscommunication. And I think it's so important that those of us who are attending this webinar, this very important webinar, and thank you, Mayo Clinic, that we each individually or anoint ourselves to be ambassadors of going out and giving facts, because we must get our people vaccinated. Dr. Corbett, I was very excited to hear you talk about herd immunity. And for my community and my family members who are talking about they are waiting for herd immunity, and for you to say that, well, you'll be waiting for a minute. I think that, we must, you debunk so many of the misgivings out there, that herd immunity is not going to happen by Christmas, or by Thanksgiving, because we create, these timelines in our minds. As you know, I have been at the forefront of addressing, building the capacity of faith community to address health disparities. And I'm in the trenches now with COVID-19. And our faith communities, our churches, our mosques across this country, many of them are doing a tremendous job. They have a line of cars coming through there. They were involved in COVID testing. They're now involved in vaccination. But we're also seeing a lot of our faith communities have been compromised. And I'm very, very concerned, saddened, and I struggle with the realities of, when you have pastors who are standing up talking about don't get, in the name of Jesus, don't get the vaccine. then our most influential community in the African American community has truly been compromised. And what are we going to do about that? And I think just like we did with HIV, we have to attack it. We have to come to those pastors, give them the facts, and if necessary, shut them down. Because it is, if you're talking about sin, and I'm not a promoter of sin, but it is sinful for any pastor to stand up and say, don't take the vaccine, or taking the vaccine is a sin. So I'm very challenged, my sisters and my brothers, that our faith communities in so many hamlets across this country have been compromised. And I think that, my health ministries, I see you there again, recognizing you again, that we must continue to support our pastors, support our bishops, to use their voice to tell folks to get vaccine, to take this information that Dr. Corbett has shared and make it real in our ministries, make it real to push it out through our communities, and to help the brother-ins and the sister-ins in our community to share fact, and not let this misinformation continue to compromise our pulpit. I'm going to stop there and turn it over to back to you, Dr. Brewer, because I can go on with this forever, and we don't have that kind of time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Seele. Really appreciated your comments. And Dr. Doubeni, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brewer, for your leadership in putting together this town hall meeting. And I want to, on behalf of Mayo Clinic, again, welcome all the participants, in particular, Dr. Corbett, for taking the time on a Saturday while you're planning other important events in your life to share your knowledge and expertise with us. And I want to start by saying that it's really surreal to be on this town hall shared with Dr. Corbett, because when, maybe step back a little bit, Mayo Clinic is actually part of the Seele initiative, which is Community Engagement Alliance Against COVID Disparities, both in Florida and Arizona. And I serve as one of the principal investigators, as we say it in the scientific world, in Arizona, and have the privilege of working with many community members, many of whom gratefully on this panel, on this Zoom event. And going back, when we began this work, I paused for a moment and said to myself, there are clinical trials going on. What's my role on this? Is my role just go out there and preach that this vaccine is safe for everyone? And I came to the conclusion that I needed to be a part of the trial. So I joined no other than the Moderna trial. And so I'm one of the participants in Moderna trial. Because I got unblinded, I discovered and found out that I was actually fully vaccinated by November 3rd. Grace be to God, I'm still symptom-free. I traveled a lot during the pandemic. I wouldn't recommend it, but I've remained symptom-free, and I've not contracted, as best I know, from the virus or gotten sick from it. I'm also a family doc, and I see patients in the clinic, and yesterday I actually saw 2 patients who had the so-called breakthrough infection. And so all of this will sound a little scary to people, but what I'm really grateful for is the really careful way in which Dr. Corbett has gone through the science, how it was put together, the time it's taken to develop the technology, the knowledge we've gained over the years to understand the technology, and how it works, and how effective it is, and how it continues to work against the evolving variants, including Delta variant, which is now 99%, maybe 100% in some places of the infections of COVID. Make no mistake about it, the pandemic is real. People are dying. Millions and millions of people have died worldwide from the pandemic, and more could die. But guess what? The vaccines can prevent this condition. So I really appreciate the thoughtfulness in going through some of the historical things that in our community drives some of this so-called mistrust. And mistrust is real. I have the same hesitations. I have the same concerns about science. I have the same concerns about what people say. But what is really clear in my role as a doctor, as a community member, is that overwhelmingly, most of the people, if not 90% of the people who get COVID-19 end up in hospital have not been vaccinated. So the question that I'll pose to our community is that, do you want to be in the hospital or do you want to be protected from it? And I really love Dr. Seele's comments in looking at the issues of trust and what the messages that were disseminated. Do we know all the answers? No, we don't know all the answers, but we know some important answers. What's really important is to remind people, as Dr. Corbett said, the science is clear. The vaccines are effective, but the science is also clear. Vaccines are not 100% effective, right? So you see one person gets the infection after the vaccine doesn't mean that it's not protecting 99% of other people from getting sick and end up in a hospital. So that's really clear. I want to again end by thanking all of you for taking the time on a Saturday to attend. We urge you to share the message that Dr. Corbett said in your community. To address questions, please don't pass judgment on people who have questions, because that's important for us to do in a non-judgmental way. Because when we pass judgment on people in terms of saying, and you have doubts, then you're bad. You have doubts, let me try to explain to you what I understand, or at least find information and share together. That's really important, because by sharing, we can all learn together. Dr. Brewer said at the beginning that Mayo Clinic has been really engaged in this work. That has been because you as community partners have led us, held us in the hand sometimes, and guided us. I'm really pleased to see some of you, many of you here, Dr. Dean, Dr. Seele, Shauna Green, and others who have worked tirelessly with us. We work with state agencies in this work, and many of you nationally. So please continue the work. The work is not done and far from over, because cases are spiking again. We want to protect our community. We want to reduce the impact. We want to address the social issues that this pandemic has caused. And we'll continue to lean on you as we do this work. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to attend.
Awesome. Sincerest thank you to you both for all that you do to better our communities and for championing health equity through community engagement. And we are just so honored to have your perspectives. And thank you for helping us to build trust in the COVID-19 vaccine in our communities. So now let's move to our Q&A with our community members and Dr. Corbett. We are so honored to have such an awesome group of community advocates and leaders join us from all three regions of our Mayo Clinic sites in Arizona, Florida, and Minnesota. So we salute you all for all of your work on the front lines to combat COVID-19. And the questions they have for Dr. Corbett were compiled from the most common questions asked by the community on the COVID-19 vaccine. So first, we have Dr. Eula Saxon-Dean, educator and community leader in Scottsdale, Arizona. She has had and led several local town halls to increase COVID-19 prevention in communities of color. So what question do you have for Dr. Corbett?
Thank you, Dr. Brewer, and a special thank you to Dr. Corbett for your dedication and service. My question is, some community members have made it through the previous COVID-19 variants without contracting COVID or getting a vaccine. How different is the Delta variant affecting the Black community? And why is this more dangerous?
Thank you for that question. And that is something that when one is making a risk assessment, that is something that they oftentimes take into consideration. Well, someone I know had COVID and they turned up okay, but for the people who don't. And so, you know, the Delta variant for one is about 2 times more infectious. That is, there are plethora of scientific reasons behind that, but long story short, when someone sneezes, they oftentimes let out more of the Delta variant. And it also has been shown to kind of stick to your cells more. So that means that more get into your body, and therefore you start infection out at a greater rate than you would for some of the original strains. And it's all of it, all encompassing, the infection, the vaccine, all of it is really a numbers game. When you are playing with more virus, that means that you have a more likely chance of that virus getting down into your lower airway and making you more sick, which is why people are presenting to the hospital with more symptoms from the Delta variant. And that is why our ICUs are currently back to being booked, even at rates of which greater rates than which they were in the beginning, towards the beginning of the pandemic, is because we're playing the numbers game, where Delta variant is just extremely far more infectious and more likely to cause more severe disease. And because of that, I like to remind people that that is where the vaccine comes into play, where you want to make sure that your individual self, are really loading your body up with as much prevention as possible to decrease your odds of getting more virus into your body, into your cells, and therefore decreasing your odds of getting more severe disease.
All right, so next we have Ms. Jocelyn Turner, Reach Initiative Director with the Partnership for Child Health in Jacksonville, Florida. Ms. Turner came out of retirement from the Florida Department of Health to enhance vaccine uptake in the African American community. Ms. Turner, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Dr. Corbett, what can communities of faith do to encourage the Black community to get vaccinated and build vaccine confidence?
You know, one of the things that to me is I've found that is really important is, number one, engaging with people like myself and a plethora of others who kind of sit on both sides of that coin, where I'm a scientist, but then also like Bible-toting Christian as well. And so, you know, one of the first things that was important to me was to engage with my own personal pastor in that regard. And finding those people, especially in some of these mega churches that kind of sit in a well-versed area with the science, but then also could like spout out Bible verses if necessary, helps to kind of bridge this connection between the faith communities and the science, which is really important. And then for faith leaders, it is important to lead by example. That is, did you get vaccinated? And to share that experience very openly, I find is extremely important. And if you have the availability in your own church to share these kinds of webinars, but moreover to host them. So there were a lot of churches that were hosting their own webinars, because there is something like sitting on the same Zoom stream that you sit on Sunday mornings to hear about a vaccine in the same way that you would hear about, you know, Jesus, really. And I find that there are churches who have done, you know, vaccine drives, and churches who even kind of embed in their announcement kind of like the science of the vaccine. So there are multiple different levels of how you can go about this as a faith leader. But for me, it's really about knowing what your power is as a faith leader and keeping the communication that you would have with someone who calls you for prayer open in the same way as someone who would call you, or who could possibly call you for questions about their health or this vaccine in particular. And, you know, I at least know that my pastor is good at finding the information in any different direction that he needs for anything that he needs to relate to his church community. And so really tapping into the resources that are within your church is very helpful.
Awesome, thank you. So now from our Minnesota team, we have Mr. Mel Reeves of Minneapolis, Minnesota. He is a human rights activist and editor of Minnesota Spokesman Recorder, the largest and oldest African-American newspaper in Minnesota, and has worked tirelessly to overcome racial, social, and health injustice in Minnesota. Turn it over to you, Mr. Reeves.
Hi, Dr. Corbett. My question is, what would your advice be to those who are sitting on the fence about the COVID-19 vaccine?
That I get it. It all comes at us very fast. We are the information, quite frankly, it changes for me as a scientist on a day-to-day basis. So I can only imagine how overwhelmed someone who is more lay and not as invested in understanding the science as I am could feel. So number one, I get it. And so my best advice is to take it all in a very digestible manner. When it becomes too overwhelming for you to say, I tap out on it today, the decision does not have to be made today. But if I'm going to make my best decision, I need to remain informed and take that information in, not on a binge going on the internet and et cetera, but really in a very digestible manner. And then also to make sure that you follow the people who are intensely into the science on a very day-to-day basis. So I personally would not have a job without the science. And so I would be one of them. And there are a lot of other resources as well. And, you know, your community physicians and et cetera could be very helpful in this regard. And the risk assessment. So I find that one thing about people who sit on the fence is that they haven't necessarily made the risk assessment in the same way that I would, which is perhaps a little bit biased. But the truth of the matter is your risk assessment has to go beyond what if I got coronavirus and was okay. A lot of people put that in part of it on the what if I got the virus. They say and I was okay. And that's how they make their risk assessment about getting the vaccine. And I think you have to really kind of take the entire picture and understand that it's, number one, it's not what if, because at this point, every single person probably in this world, quite frankly, will come in contact with this virus one day. And you have to decide whether or not you want to be as protected as possible or not. And there are obviously some ways that you can do that from a public health standpoint or a social standpoint, like distancing, remaining home, always wearing your mask. But you have to decide where you want that to, how you want to live your life. And if you decide that you always, forever, are going to stay in your mask and remain distance and kind of protect yourself in that way, then that's fine. But also the chances of you coming into contact with the virus increase on a day-to-day as the transmission continues to increase. And so when you come into contact with that virus, do you want to be protected from very severe disease? Yes or no?
Thank you.
And really, at this point, the vaccine is really the one of the reasons why I went into vaccinology is because it's very clear that vaccines are really one of the only very cost-effective ways to get us out of situations like this, where they equal the playing field. You know, if you take the vaccine and someone who is not necessarily just like you take the vaccine, your chances of coming out of an infection with this virus actually becomes more equal in that way. And so it is about really assessing what those chances are and making the decision for yourself and staying on top of the information.
Thank you. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Charles Crutchfield of Minneapolis-St. Paul, an internationally known dermatologist, distinguished Mayo Medical School alumnus, and professor of medicine at the University of Minnesota. As the immediate past president of the Minnesota Association of Black Physicians, he has selflessly committed to boosting vaccination rates in the Black community, even starting a COVID-19 vaccination clinic in his private practice. Dr. Crutchfield.
Hey, Dr. Corbett, that was fantastic. I want to congratulate you, and I really appreciate your talking. You know, being in clinical practice for the last 22 years, I love the slide that talked about all the different excuses. I have patients say, oh, it's going to make me infertile, or mRNA has not been around long enough. And that's something you can maybe talk about. People say, we don't know the 10-year history of messenger RNA. But I find that one of the things that are really most effective in my practice is when I tell patients, when they're looking for good advice, ask someone that you trust, like your physician or your pharmacist or a friend, a family member that you trust. That's really important too. So we hear those, and I also refer them to some of the videos of the patients who are in the hospital right now that are dying, and they all say, I wasn't vaccinated, I wish I was. And, acknowledging that 99% of people that are dying now are not vaccinated. So you said, if you don't want to die, dying is optional now in the United States from COVID because of your vaccine and your work. So acknowledging that 99% of people are not vaccinated, I would like to ask you, how can physicians and other healthcare providers be better champions and community advocates to increase COVID-19 vaccine acceptance and uptake in the African-American community? Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that one of the things, even myself, quite frankly, I sit with this a lot. And I'm not a physician, but I'm a scientist, and I've been in the vaccine development since I was like 19 years old. And so the conversation around the COVID-19 vaccine is just so fresh to people. And the part of that is because we haven't been talking about vaccines in our community just kind of overarchingly for a very long time. And so I think that starting the conversation about vaccines with people out more broad without being specific to COVID-19 helps a lot from a physician standpoint, because it reminds people that your knowledge didn't start yesterday. And so a lot of times I like to remind people that, like, sure, the vaccine that you hear about from me is COVID-19, but like, did you know I also did this and that and that? And because that helps people to kind of frame that this is the thing that I study kind of and have been studying on a day-to-day basis. I think that videos are very helpful. I find anecdotes to be helpful on a one-to-one conversation level. The problem with anecdotes is, as we all know, the coin could be flipped and they could just bring you their anecdote, like, oh yeah, my friend was like, got COVID and she was fine. And so then you're basically having a conversation about anecdotes, which can be cyclic and maybe sometimes not get much of anywhere. And then making the picture more broad, right? So when I say we, I'd like to kind of include myself, because this entire process of talking to the community is not necessarily new to me, but the dire necessity of communicating properly to the community for certain is. I've always talked about the flu vaccine, but quite frankly, flu might kill 65,000 people a year. We're at almost 700,000 with COVID. And so one of the things is that starting the conversation on a very high level numerically, in the same way that you framed the beginning of how you introduce your question, is like, the chances on a very high level. And that kind of eliminates the possibility it decreases the possibility for the insertion of anecdote. And then it reminds people of how they should be framing their own risk assessment. I find that maybe the fault of the schools or just how critical thinking is taught or not taught or whatever, but risk assessment is not something that is oftentimes innate, because we live in a society where a lot of times our risk assessment is very much framed by what we already know. But one thing about the risk assessment with this vaccine is about framing it about what you might not know and that an expert is only going to be able to fill in the holes for. And so reminding people that when you're making your risk assessment, I am here to help you with that because I am the expert. And taking that burden of their risk assessment off of their shoulders and giving it back to you as a physician is very, very helpful. I know that was like a lot, but I've spent this is one thing that for me has been most troubling with the level of outreach, and it kind of like, why I do this. And this is like my 71st town hall and blah, blah, and I'm like exhausted. But really these conversations are almost they're not cookbook. Like, I don't think that anyone could really open page 36 of how do you talk to someone about the COVID-19 vaccine and get the answer. The truth is, almost certainly for people who are on the fence, the conversation is tailored to how they speak. And if they're speaking in anecdote, then you have to speak in anecdote. if they come at you with a holistic view, then you are oftentimes in a better position to come up with a holistic view. But the one thing that almost always works in a, not in a I'm the doctor and you're not kind of way, is that reminding them that you understand the risk assessment analysis that they are doing and walking them through it step by step.
Awesome. Thank you so much. What an amazing event. I would like to again thank our incredible keynote speaker, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, our panelist, Dr. Pernessa Seele, and Dr. Chyke Doubeni, as well as our community members for joining us today and their extraordinary service to our communities. I would also like to thank our co-organizers and technical support of this event at Mayo Clinic, Mrs. Barhia Omar, Mr. Marion Kelly, Dr. Michelle Halyard, and Dr. Eddie Green. And last but not least, we would like to thank you, our community, for joining us today. Take care, stay safe, and get vaccinated. Thank you.
Thank you.